Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Amen. O Lord my God, help me to be obedient without reserve, poor without servility, chaste without compromise, humble without pretense, joyful without depravity, serious without affectation, active without frivolity, submissive without bitterness, truthful without duplicity, fruitful in good works without presumption, quick to revive my neighbor without haughtiness, and quick to edify others by word and example without simulation. Grant me, O Lord, an ever watchful heart, that no alien thought can lure me away from you, a noble heart that no base love can sully, an upright heart that no perverse intention can lead astray, an invincible heart that no distress can overcome, an unfettered heart that no impetuous desires can enchain. O Lord my God, also bestow upon me understanding to know you, zeal to seek you, wisdom to find you, a life that is pleasing to you, unshakable perseverance, and a hope that will one day take hold of you. May I do penance here below and patiently bear your chastisements. May I also receive the benefits of your grace in order to taste your heavenly joys and contemplate your glory. Amen.
Amen.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Well, that was a prayer from St. Thomas Aquinas. There you are.
Joey, so good to see you.
Thank you, Mr. Newton.
Okay.
Make them available to people if they come
You
in.
doing okay,
Thank
girl? It is so good to see you.
All righty. Well, last time we spoke about, introduced Thomas's Summa Theologica, the existence of God, discussed about whether the existence of God is self-evident. Thomas decided that it was, reasoned that it was not. Whether the existence of God can be demonstrated, and Thomas reasoned that it can be, and whether God exists. And of course, Thomas reasoned that it can be. So today we're going to begin our discussion of Thomas's famous 5 ways. 5 ways to demonstrate the existence of God. Okay? Before we get into that, though, I want to talk about something that I thought was very interesting. I listened to this video conversation between Jordan Peterson, who is, some of you may have heard of, professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. He became kind of famous in the last couple of years when Canada passed a law mandating that people refer or address others according to the pronouns that they prefer, regardless of their biological gender or sex. And Peterson was profoundly opposed to this, not because he wanted to disrespect or was interested in disrespecting transgendered persons but because it was the first time, he said, in Western civilization where a government mandated speech, said that you must speak this way. Okay? And he says that that's abhorrent, it's going down the wrong road. We ought not be doing that. Government has no business mandating that people say certain things, especially if there's certain things that they're mandated to say are contrary to their conscience. Susan Blackmore is a visiting professor at the University of Plymouth. You may not be familiar with her. I wasn't until I watched this conversation. She's done a lot of work on psychological memes and such, parapsychology and such, and she's an atheist. Now, Jordan Peterson is not a Christian, but he is a theist, and the topic of their conversation was on whether God is necessary to make life sense, to make sense of life. Whether God is necessary to make sense of life. Peterson said that it is. Belief in God exists. Belief in God is necessary God is necessary to make sense of life because Peterson says that we desire meaning innately. We desire meaning in life. And in particular, he says, we seek a meaning that is deep enough to sustain us through tragedy. We spoke about this somewhat in September. The bottom line is life is hard. And there's no one who's gotten much past 15 or 20 years who hasn't already learned that lesson. Life is hard. There's a lot of joy in life. There's a lot of happiness in life. There's a lot of wonderful things in life. But there's also a lot of struggle, a lot of pain, a lot of hurt, and not a little tragedy even. And without God, Peterson thinks it is impossible to understand a meaning of life that is deep enough to sustain us through tragedy. Blackmore is an atheist, and she said something that I thought was very interesting, because Peterson challenged her on this point exactly. How do you get through the tragedies? And how do you find meaning in life, even in the face of the fact that life is sometimes very difficult and even tragic? And she said, when horrible things, and this is a quote, when horrible things happen to me, or I read about some terrible thing going on in the world, my response is, nothing matters. It's all empty and meaningless. This is how the world is. Get used to it. Get on with it, girl. Now, from my own experience, I have no idea how anything in that statement is the least bit attractive or sustaining, if you will. And Peterson challenged her on this because one of the big points that Peterson made in the conversation was that you say you're an atheist, but you act as if God exists. And how does he know that? Because she gets out of bed in the morning. And she dresses herself. And she writes books. And she does things with her life that are meaningful. Okay? And he says without God, that would be really impossible to do. Because there's just no ultimate meaning. And in other words, in everything that we do to give meaning to our life is pretense. Ultimately, it's just pretense. And Blackmore recognizes that. You know, she loves writing her books, but she says that that's just the thing that this particular organism does. But ultimately, it's just pretense, and life is meaningless. It sounds dismal, and it is. It sounds depressing, and it is. It can even be psychopathic, and it is. But we as believers, as Catholics, have to recognize that that kind of statement is greatly attractive to a large number of people in this world, especially young people, who find life meaningless and who like to pretend that, who act as if their life is meaningful, all right, by getting up and doing the things that they do every day, but deep down, if they accept what they're saying, if they accept their life philosophy, deep down, it's all pretense. Now, Peterson would say, deeper down, okay, it's the acceptance that there's something more to life than what this world has to offer. And deeper down, it's a recognition of God. Whether we were willing to say it, okay, we recognize God's existence because we, as human beings, we cannot live without meaning. And Blackmore insists that we can, and we do. And Peterson says, no, you're pretending. You're just pretending. So, that isn't exactly on topic, but I thought it was a very interesting, a very interesting conversation. It's on the website for an organization called Unbelievable, and they have conversations between believers and non-believers about important questions. And that's the first one that I've listened to, and it's very good, very well done, very civil, which is kind of a nice change from our political and social environment. So it was nice. It was nice. You know, the only time it kind of got a little uncivil was when Blackmore suggested to Peterson, you know, isn't it offensive that you're telling me that, you know, I really do believe in God, I'm just not willing to admit it? Well, sometimes the truth is offensive, and it needs to be. You know, if your good friend is trying to build a house on the principle that 2 + 2 = 3, okay, you might have risked offending him by correcting him on that, but it really is the loving thing to do, because you know ultimately that house is going to fall, and he and his family may be in it, and the consequences would be devastating. So the loving thing to do is to speak the truth always, even when it's offensive. All right, so let's get to Thomas and his 5 ways. And I think I left my copy on here. So let's grab this. All right, so let's discuss the 5 ways. All right, the first way for demonstrating the existence of God, Thomas thought was the most manifest way, the most obvious way, in other words, to demonstrate the existence of God. And that was from the argument from motion. So, well, this is what Thomas writes. The first and more manifest way is the argument from motion. It is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion. Now whatever is in motion is put in motion by another. For nothing can be in motion unless it is in potency to that towards which it is in motion. But a thing moves insofar as it is in act. For motion is nothing else than the reduction of something from potency to act. But nothing can be reduced from potency to act except by something in a state of act. Thus, that which is actually hot, as fire, makes wood, which is potentially hot, to be actually hot, and thereby moves and changes it. Now, it is not possible that the same thing should be at once in act and potency in the same respect, but only in different respects. For what is actually hot cannot simultaneously be potentially hot, though it is simultaneously potentially cold. It is therefore impossible that in the same respect and in the same way a thing should be both mover and moved, that is, that it should move itself. Therefore, whatever is moved must be moved by another. If that by which it is moved be itself moved, then this also must be moved by another. If that by which it is moved be itself moved, then this also must be moved by another, and that by another again. But this cannot go on to infinity, because then there would be no first mover, and consequently no other mover, seeing that subsequent movers move only because they are moved by the first mover, just as the staff moves only because it is moved by the hand. Therefore it is necessary to arrive at a first mover which is moved by no other, and this everyone understands to be God. All right. Well, I don't think there's anything else to say. I mean, it's just right there. You know, it was funny, you know, not to say that Thomas is guilty of this, But in one of our diaconate classes when we were studying philosophy with Deacon Joe Stackhouse, he gave us examples of philosophical excerpts of philosophical works to read. And it was kind of like this. It was just like, what the heck are you talking about? And some of the guys, you know, I have an undergraduate degree in philosophy, okay? But I don't sit and read it every day, okay? But most of these guys don't. I mean, they're farmers, they're businessmen, they're doctors, they're therapists. They have come from all kinds of different backgrounds, military, business, etc. And one of the questions was, do they write like this on purpose? And Deacon Joe kind of said, well, yeah, they sort of do. Because it's almost like if they wrote in plain English, they wouldn't be taken seriously by other philosophers. I don't know if that's true or not, but there you go. So what I did for you, and for me, was to take this and put it in plainer English, which is underneath your quote from the Summa. So the first way, the argument for motion. Number one, we see that some things are in motion. Number two, whatever's in motion is put in motion by something other than itself. Number three, if what put it into motion was also put into motion, then it was also put into motion by something other than itself, and that by yet another, and so on. 4. But this can't go on forever, since then there would be no first mover to move the others, and so there would be no motion at all. And 5, it's necessary then to arrive at a first mover that's not put into motion by another, and everyone understands this to be God. So I don't know if that makes it a little bit easier. I hope it makes it a little bit easier, but we're going to break it down some even still. Okay? So first of all, and I'm going to spend more time on the first way, the argument for motion, because it sets the stage for the second and third way. Thomas regarded the first way, as I said, as the most obvious of the ways that demonstrate the existence of God, and included it in several of his writings. So let's look at the, let's look at the claim made by each premise to see if we can have confidence in the conclusion. So the first 4 points there are your 4 premises, and the 5th point is your conclusion. First, the first point. We see that some things are in motion. That's the first premise. We see that some things are in motion. No one would dispute this. No one would dispute this except maybe those who think all reality is an illusion. In that case, nothing's real. Barring that extreme claim, I think we can call the first premise as a given. There are things, some things in the world that are in motion, that change. Okay? Now, let's talk about Thomas's understanding of motion real quick. He's not necessarily talking about, he's not really talking primarily about locomotion. That's what we think of, okay, when we think of motion. Moving that from there to there and back again. Locomotion, okay? The train pulling out of the station, all right? Or, if you will, a billiard ball being hit by a cue into another billiard ball that hits another billiard ball that hits another billiard ball, and so on and so on and so on. That's not what Thomas thinks of as motion here. What he thinks of as motion is more what we think of as change, all right, from one state to another. He talks about it as a change from potentiality to actuality. Okay? From potentiality to actuality. Now that sounds complicated, but it's really not. If you think about wood, and this is the example he uses. Let's talk about a wooden log. Okay? There's our wooden log. It's just sitting there. Is that wood hot or cold? It's cold. It's just sitting there. There's nothing happening to it. It's just sitting on the ground. It's cold. Okay? Is it actually hot or actually cold?
Actually cold.
It's actually cold. Is it potentially hot or potentially cold?
Potentially hot.
Potentially hot. That's right. Thomas, one of the points he makes is that you cannot be potentially and actually the same thing at the same time. Okay? You cannot be potentially hot and actually hot at the same time. You can't be potentially cold and actually cold at the same time. You can either be potentially hot, you can either be actually hot and potentially cold, or actually cold and potentially hot. Does that make sense? You with me? Okay, good. So right here, the wood is actually cold and potentially hot. So what Thomas is talking about is how does the wood move from potentially hot to actually hot?
You set it on fire.
You set it on fire. Okay? So fire, in this case, is the mover. Fire is the mover, because fire is that which moves the wood from potentially hot to actually hot, from potentiality to actuality. Does that make sense? You with me, Bernadette?
I'm Dorothy.
Dorothy, I apologize.
That's okay. I like Bernadette.
That's okay.
My daughter is Bernadette, so that was a compliment. I don't know anybody named Dorothy. You with me?
Yeah,
Okay.
to a certain point.
To a certain
Because
point.
I got to talk to you about something.
Okay.
Water.
Water.
It generates the oceans. The oceans generate its own power and energy, creates waves. The waves are coming from within itself.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see how the motion can be applied to ocean waves, because they roll in and they can be destructive, or they can be soft and roll into the beach and disintegrate, but then there's also always another wave coming in behind it.
Well, yeah, but what moves the waves? What moves
The water
water?
itself, it
No.
generates its own power.
No, it doesn't generate its own power. What controls the tides?
Is it the moon?
Oh,
The moon.
the moon.
The moon, gravity,
There's no moon
the
in the
wind.
daytime.
But the moon's still there. The moon is still there, we just can't see it. The moon is always there, it's never not
Yeah.
there.
But, okay,
But wind also causes waves.
So you've got wind, you've got gravitational pull, you've got the movement of the earth, you've got the pull from the moon, you've got several things. These are the things that control the tides, plus you've got the weather. Yes. What's your name?
Judy.
Judy.
Joe. You're Joey.
Or no,
Judy.
Judy. That's okay.
My God.
I'm glad I'm not the only one wrong with names.
We don't go by many names.
Judy, you wanted to say?
Pardon me?
You wanted to say?
Just answer.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
All right. So the first premise, okay, is accepted. We see that some things, like wood, move from potentiality to actuality, from potentially hot to actually hot. We see these things in life, and so we can accept the first premise. We see that some things are in motion. We see that wood is one of those things. The second premise claims that whatever is in motion is put in motion by something other than itself. This isn't quite so obvious. What's Thomas thinking here? This argument is sometimes called the argument from change because what Thomas means by motion, as I just explained, is change from potentiality to actuality. That might seem like fancy philosophy talk, but let's break it down. We just broke it down. Uses the example of fire and wood. Fire is actually hot, while wood is potentially hot. The wood can't make itself hot because the wood doesn't possess heat, and nothing can give itself what it doesn't have. And that's an important key. Nothing can give itself what it does not have. If the wood does not possess heat, it cannot give itself heat. Okay? Nothing can give itself what it does not have. If that were so, then it would be possible for the wood to be potentially hot and actually hot at the same time, which is a clear contradiction. But the wood does have the potential to be hot. How can the wood move from being potentially hot to actually hot? By being moved by the fire. The fire being hot by nature, that is, if it isn't hot, it isn't fire, can transfer its heat to the wood, thereby moving the wood from potentially hot to actually hot. You with me? Okay? The fire moves the wood from potentially hot to actually hot. But why can't we just stop at the fire and say the fire was the beginning of the series of motion? This speaks to the third premise, which claims that if something that puts another thing into motion was itself put into motion, then it was also put into motion by something other than itself, and that by yet another, and so on. So we have to ask, from where did the fire come? There are three things fire needs to exist. What are those three things?
Oxygen.
Oxygen, fuel,
Heat.
and heat. Oxygen, fuel, and heat. Okay? So the fire must have been transferred from something that possessed those actualities, which then moved to the potentiality of taking fire in order for the fire to be then transferred to the wood and so on. So, what brought the fire into existence? Perhaps two pieces of wood were rubbed together. Perhaps a match was struck against a flint, giving flame to the match. The match was then set to the wood. But from where did the match and flint come? And so on. Nothing can cause itself to move from potentiality to actuality. Nothing can cause itself to move from potentiality to actuality. Because if it is potentially hot, okay, then it doesn't possess heat, and it cannot give itself what it doesn't have. Okay? So the fire has to come from somewhere too, right? So something moved, all right, in order to bring the fire into existence so that the fire could then transfer its heat to the wood. So something had to move the fire from potential existence into actual existence. Okay? There isn't any fire in this room. No fire in this room. Okay? But if I have a match and flint, boom, I can make fire. Fire has the potential to exist. But it doesn't possess existence at the same time that it possesses the potential to exist. Does that make sense? You can't potentially exist and actually exist at the same time. That's a contradiction. So the fire potentially exists, and the match and the flint, striking the match against the flint, brings the fire from potential existence to actual existence. So it moves the fire from potentiality to actuality. Got it? Okay. But what about humans and animals? They move themselves. Strictly speaking, when a cat's tail moves, it's the muscles, tendons, and bones that are moving. which are moved in response to the motor neurons which are inspired to move by the cat's will or instinct, which matured with the development of the cat's neurological system, and so on. So this is consistent with Thomas's claim that whatever's in motion is put in motion by something other than itself. If we break the movement of humans and animals down to the movement of the individual parts, and then the development of those individual parts, and then the conception of the person or animal from ovum to sperm, and so on. So it seems that the second and third premise also stand. Nothing can bring itself, nothing can move itself from potentiality to actuality, including from potential existence to actual existence. Okay? Any movement at all. Are you with me?
Yeah.
Dorothy, how you doing?
I'm thinking.
Okay. Okay. Do
I
you have
get in
any
trouble
questions?
a lot, too. I get in trouble a lot too when I think, but go on, this
We love you.
This is,
Let's look-
this is interesting. You know, I'm thinking about these beautiful things that students do. They do a whole room of dominoes and
Yes.
someone punches the first one.
Exactly.
And what they set off can be a magnificent thing,
Exactly.
but it takes a little finger or whatever they
Something
use
to start it, yeah.
to start it.
Exactly.
So it can't do it by itself. That's what I was thinking of at
Exactly.
that time. That's a good example, I think.
That's a fine example. Now that's an example of locomotion, which is fine as far as it goes. Okay? As far as it goes, that's fine. But Thomas is talking about a different kind of motion. He's talking about, how could I put it?
Change of state.
Yeah, he's talking about more of a change of state, if you will. Okay, a change of state. So for instance, let's talk about water, all right, moving from a liquid to a gas. Okay? Can it do that by itself? No, it can't. So it needs something to make that change. Okay? And heat is generally what does that. Heat causes water to evaporate. So heat is what causes the water to move from a state of liquid to a state of gas. Cold is what makes water move from a state of liquid to a state of ice. Okay? So that's more the motion that Thomas is talking about. Okay? The locomotion isn't entirely removed from this. All right? You do need an engine to pull the train. All right? You do need an engine to pull the train. And we'll talk about that in a bit. All right. So Thomas's first premise is that we see that some things are in motion. We accept that premise. Whatever's in motion is put in motion by something other than itself. Okay? We accept that premise because you cannot possess what you don't have. Okay? You can't possess heat if you don't have heat. Okay? So you need something else to give you the heat. Okay? The wood doesn't possess heat, so it can't make itself hot. It needs fire to make itself hot. Okay? That's the second premise. The wood can't make itself hot. It can't move itself from potentially hot to actually hot. It needs the fire to do that. But the third premise is that the fire also needs something to move it from potentially existing to actually existing, so that it can then move the wood from potentially hot to actually hot. Did you have a question, Julie?
I was just thinking that this works with holiness.
Yeah.
Because if you are a person and you're potentially able to be holy, you can't be actually holy without God's grace and God's action to move you that way.
That's a really good
So-
example.
So that makes you humble, because when you think of this, that makes you humble because you realize it's not done on your own.
That's right. It's not done on your
It's
own.
beautiful.
That's very good. That's an good. I think Thomas would be proud. All right, now the fourth premise is still a bigger claim. The fourth premise is this can't go on forever, since then there would be no first mover to move the others, and so there would be no motion at all. Thomas says that the series of movers can't go back forever, infinitely, since there would be no first mover to move the others, and there would be no movement at all. Again, we tend to think of cause and effects happening one after another, like your domino example. One domino falls, and the next one falls, and the next one falls, and the next one falls. The cue ball hits the first billiard ball, which hits the second one, which hits the third. Okay? First comes the cause, then comes the effect. But consider the example Thomas offers of a hand moving a staff. The hand doesn't move prior to the staff. Rather, the staff moves with the hand. Perhaps the staff, well, let's use a spoon. Perhaps the staff is really a spoon, and you're using that to stir a pot of stew. Okay? The hand, the staff, and the broth, and the carrots, and the beef cubes, and the whatever else is potatoes. I'm getting hungry. They're all moving at the same time, right? They're all moving at the same time. It's not one after another, after another, after another. They're all moving at the same time. Okay? In this sense, okay, it's in this sense that an infinite regression of causes is impossible. For if there were no first mover, then there would be no